Welcome everybody to our latest session of the EVN Masterclasses. So these EVN Masterclasses are a great opportunity to tap into the fantastic network of experts that Basic is lucky to have and to share their expertise with our Emerging Voices network. As you know, the Masterclasses are aimed to be an accessible digital resource primarily for our own EVN members, but also for the general public. So as we've mentioned before, we now have a landing page on a Basic website. We can find a list specifically of all of our past Masterclasses. Today, I'm excited to introduce our very own Dr. Gry Thomasen. So Dr. Gry Thomasen is the research director at Basic and the program director of our program on risk reduction. She's an expert in NATO, including NATO-Russia relations, nuclear non-proliferation, and the Arctic, and she leads Basic's work in these areas. So Gry has published in high-impact journals such as Marine Policy, an international journal. She is the co-editor of the very soon to be, I believe, forthcoming, the Palgrave Handbook of Non-State Actors in East-West Relations. She has also authored policy reports and policy briefs providing advice directly to governments. Gry also holds a PhD in Cold War history from the University of Copenhagen and was awarded a postdoc grant by the Carlsberg Foundation and the Danish Ministry of Defence to undertake research into nuclear non-proliferation at the Danish Institute for International Studies. So prior to joining Basic, she has also been visiting postdoctoral research fellow at the Cold War History Research Centre in Budapest and a visiting researcher at the Centre for Science and Security Studies at King's College London. So Gry has also been a delegated researcher for several white books on international security and Greenland. She's been a consultant on draft bills on nuclear non-proliferation and export controls. She's given evidence to standing committees in the Danish Parliament on international security in the Arctic. And furthermore, Gry has participated in as an expert at IAEA conferences, EU Non-Proliferation Consortium, and the NPT Review Conference. She also holds an MA in history with Russian from the University of Copenhagen and a BA in history and Russian from Moscow State University and Copenhagen University. So I think, as you probably gathered from that introduction, so today Gry will be very qualified to speak to you about how to write policy papers. And as I mentioned earlier, at the end, we'll have some time for discussion. So if you have any thoughts, any comments or questions that you may have, you will have the opportunity to do that. So with introductions out the way, I'll happily hand back over to Gry to get you started on this very exciting workshop.
Thank you, Declan. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And hello, everyone. It's really, really nice to meet some EVN members, at least online. Also, thank you to Basic's EVN program for inviting me to talk about policy papers and policy recommendations. I have a PowerPoint that I would like to share with you, and I will just do that now. Okay, well, I will start out by talking about what a policy paper actually is. Before I move on to talking about a few things you need to consider before you start writing a policy paper. And this is then followed by a section where I talk about writing a policy paper, including the structure of a good policy paper. And finally, I will talk about how we do policy recommendations. Right, I need to make sure I got everything right here. Yeah. So first of all, what is a policy paper? And I think there are four main components to every policy paper. First of all, it must deal with a complex issue. It must present a precise summary of the issue in a way that your reader can understand it immediately. It must help your reader understand what options that are available to solve the problem that you would like to solve. And you must recommend a policy, and this includes helping your reader understand why some policies are impractical and why a specific policy option is the best or the most practical option to choose. And before you write your policy paper, there are three key questions. Actually, I can see on the PowerPoint there's actually four, but for the sake of it, let's stay at 3 key questions. First of all, there must be a clear connection to policy. And the connection to policy can be seen in 2 ways. The connection can be that they're in the sense that the problem is already on the policymaker's desk, or it can be a problem or an issue that you think should be on the policymaker's desk. Your errand in that instance means that your connection is for you to be able to place it on the desk of the policymaker. The second question you need to ask yourself is, who is your audience? Who are you writing to? Are you writing to a prime minister? Are you writing to a president? Are you writing to a civil servant, a diplomat, the media, or private companies, or something completely different? And it's important that you understand who you're writing to so that you can tailor your message specifically. So when you're tailoring your message, it involves that you understand what they are able to do. And equally important, it's important that you understand what the constraints are that they are facing. In this connection, it's important to understand that policy outcomes are often less ideal because policymakers, they have many pressures and they have many restrictions. Policymaking is a complex issue, as I'm sure you all know. So as a starting point, you need to take into consideration that 1, policymakers are obligated to their publics. 2, there are competing priorities and limited resources within government, which also constrain policymakers. Other factors such as geopolitics, war, or what else might be going on in the international system constrains them too. And often policymakers act with limited information. You know, how can you know everything about a given subject area before you're reaching a decision? And this is most commonly known when we are talking about war, where you quickly have to make a decision and you can't possibly know the subject matter from each and every angle. There is a rule, of course, but in short, you can say policymakers, they are constrained by politics, they're constrained by resources, competing priorities, and limited information. So when you're writing your policy paper, you have to acknowledge the limited range of options available to them. You have to be grounded in their reality, otherwise you're not being convincing. For example, we all know Sweden entered NATO recently, and clearly because NATO is a nuclear alliance and is relying on nuclear deterrence, Sweden's traditional advocacy of nuclear disarmament will have to be done in a different manner to previously. This is a good example of how, you know, the international environment has changed, and therefore the room and the way you can tailor a policy recommendation to them has to change accordingly. I have another example where we at BASIC, we had a project on NATO-Russia risk reduction, and we started the project before the war, and then the war broke out, and this fundamentally changed the way that we could continue our project. For example, could we be talking to track 1 from Russia? And of course we could not, so we had to change our whole methodology around this project. So there is a reality consisting of constraint and opportunity that you need to take into consideration when you are formulating your policy advice. However, there's also a rule number 2, which is don't be constrained by rule number 1. And I think it is important that you understand that pointing out the weakness of a policy in addressing a problem is an important service that you can provide. Strong arguments, they can break down some of the constraints. For example, it can help policymakers advocate for more resources. It can help them shift their priorities or even take political risks in the face of domestic or elite opinion. I also think it's equally important that you realize that you can help your policymakers reconsider factors that they see as impossible to overcome, and you can help them seeing that they are adjustable to the current or the near future reality. So when you're starting writing a policy paper, I think you should start out by asking yourself, is this an existing problem that the policymaker already know of? Is this a problem that is already on their desk? Or is this a problem that is not yet on their radar? And I think that's a good question to start asking yourself. And then your next question is, who are you actually writing to, as I spoke about earlier? And then my last question I would always ask myself before I do a policy paper is, why is this not being done already? This is a sort of a reality check. You need to make sure that you have researched the entire field to understand if others are onto the same issue that you are, if others are already recommending something that you would like to recommend, etc., etc. But then we reach to how to structure your policy paper. So you need to have, obviously, you need to have an attractive title that immediately tells your reader what your paper is about. And that is actually not as easy as it sounds. I, for example, was writing a policy paper, a policy report with 2 colleagues here at Basic. We spent more than half a year writing this. And from the very beginning, we were trying to figure out exactly what we wanted to entitle our report. And after 6 months of deliberations, we finally ended up with a title that was Arctic Diplomacy at Crossroads, Addressing Present and Future Geopolitical Strategic Risk. And it sounds so simple and it sounds so, straightforward, but this took us 3 people over 6 months to figure out exactly what we should entitle our report. And then, of course, you should use headings and subheadings, and you should break the policy paper into short sections to make it easier for your reader to read it and for your reader to digest all this knowledge that you are presenting in your paper. And then, of course, you should always use references. And I know this is also sort of like an obvious thing to do, but references, they're important for many things. And one of the things that is very important too is for you to show your reader that you know your area, that you are well traversed in the area that you have an opinion about. And this is something that is backing up the policy recommendation that you are going to give them. So there's, of course, more than one way to structure a policy paper, but there is one golden rule. And the golden rule is to place your policy recommendations up front and then repeat them in your text. This template that is put here is something I find very useful, that I use all the time, and it can be scaled up and it can be scaled down. However, I believe that each of these components, they need to be there. So you need to have an executive summary that presents an overview of the complex problem that needs to be solved and the proposed policy option that you offer. You should always include a context section that lets the reader know why there is a need for a policy response, including a summary of the current policy or lack of policy. And then you present your analysis. Your analysis is, of course, extremely important. Based on your analysis, then you present the proposed policy recommendation and you make a strong case for why it is more desirable to do what you suggest rather than what is already being done, or in the case nothing is being done, then show clearly why it is desirable to do something about it. And finally, you have to provide some concrete steps to be taken in implementing your proposed option. Of course, the length of these things can vary. Some policy reports, they can be 30, 40 pages. You can have policy briefs that is like 5 pages, and then you can also have 1-pagers. And they would actually all have these components in them. Which brings me to how to make policy recommendations. So you have now identified your problem. You have identified whether or not it is on the policymaker's desk, or if you want to put the problem on your policymaker's desks. You have identified who you are writing to. You have identified their constraints and their opportunities. So now you are ready to write your recommendations based on your analysis. And I know I've said this before, and it seems straightforward, but sometimes you come across recommendations that is actually not based on an analysis, or perhaps very loosely based on the analysis, and they will be discarded immediately. So when you're doing your policy recommendation, first of all, you have to be realistic. You know their constraints, you know their complexities, so you guide them out of them to allow them to pursue the policy recommendation that you believe is useful to solve the problem that you have identified. Yeah. So for example, I have been arguing for the establishment of an Arctic Risk Reduction Center for quite a while. And first I said, establish an Arctic Risk Reduction Center. And then I realized I had not taken the constraints into consideration. So instead, I would go with establish a working group under this and this ministry to investigate if an Arctic Risk Reduction Center is the right idea for Arctic stability. So my argument for the recommendation is therefore that I recommend the idea of establishing an Arctic Risk Reduction Center should be brought to their consideration. Yeah. And that's me recognizing that the government at the time that I was writing for, they couldn't just do that. Of course not. There were many different constraints. Then you also have to be specific. Are there, for example, more than one tool to reach the outcome that you would like? So while you always want to avoid overwhelming the policymaker, you can address the same problem from more than one angle. Again, I have an example. I found that NATO member states, they have implemented the 2021 Brussels Agreement on Climate Change and Security very differently. So I thought it's a good idea to make sure the alliance are on par at least. So I recommended first, measures to increase awareness of climate change effects on security, and second, to establish a working group to investigate the impacts on NATO security of this very uneven implementation of climate security measures. So it's the same problem that we are trying to solve, but we are coming at it from two different angles. I also asked the basic staff on policy papers and recommendations. I asked them for their top tips for how to write policy writing, and here are all these recommendations that they came up with. And there are loads of them, and don't worry, I will share all of these with you after this talk. I will also share the PowerPoints with you. But here are they. So this is what I had to say. Oops, sorry. About policy papers, and I would be curious to hear if you have any questions for me.
Great. Thank you very much, Gry. That was yeah, that was an excellent introduction, I think, to writing policy papers, and something that, you know, in this career field is something that's a really, really important skill, and also something that perhaps when you're doing your BA and your MA, something you're not really specifically taught how to do. So I think, yeah, it's a really important skill session. So thank you very much for that. And now we're ready to open the floor up to questions from our EVN members. So this is your opportunity to speak to Gry directly and to ask any questions you have on your mind, any comments you have on the talk. And yeah, as there's a really good attendance today, so I'm hoping that we have a really good conversation about this. So if you would like to raise your hand, if you're willing to speak, publicly, and maybe turn your camera on if you want to speak as well. If you don't feel comfortable talking, you can also type it up in the chat and we can read it out and speak about it as well. So there's no pressure if you don't want to actually speak or show your face. But yeah, I think I will use host's privilege to ask a question first of all to get us going. I think what I would like to ask Gry specifically is, when So once you've submitted your policy recommendations, how have you ever, or has it happened frequently, where you've had states then ask you for a conversation, for example, to maybe explain or further the case, or to discuss what they could do about it with you in person? Like, have you ever been then invited to actually have a conversation with state makers, or to submit kind of further materials?
Yeah. Yes. So what we have had happen here, basic, is that we were writing a series of reports on Arctic security, and following these reports, which all came with 8 policy recommendations per report, we were invited to give evidence at this conference that they would have at the Canadian Ministry of Defence. They were the ones that we were writing this report for. So you had an opportunity to put forward more clearly and discuss with the policymakers the recommendations that you gave. It wasn't me that it was on human security, so it wasn't me. It was one of my colleagues, Chiara, who was doing that. And normally, what would happen in these, when you are providing policy advice to governments, is that you're also saying to them that you're always happy to talk to them more in greater depth about what you're recommending. You're always offering them a verbal briefing. You're always offering them, whatever they would like, and that happens on a regular basis when you're doing good policy work and good policy recommendations. I have given briefings for various ministries of foreign affairs, and this is also something that can bring you into giving the evidence for standing committees in various parliaments. But a good rule of thumb is that when you're doing this kind of work, and if you're doing it specifically on a grant from a government, you should always remember to say to them that you will be happy to discuss further with them. And you would be surprised to see how many of them that would actually say, oh, we would actually like to hear more about this or that. Then sometimes it's also, you're giving all of this advice and it feels like it's just disappearing into a void. But then all of a sudden you can maybe recognize some of the words that you have written from a policy paper from a government, or you hear from other governments that they had received your report from that government, etc., etc. So you're not always, privy to know exactly how far your policy recommendations they go. But rest assured, if you do good policy recommendations, they will of course be listened to by governments.
Thank you very much, Gry. I think that's really promising to hear as well. It seems like a good way to start a dialogue as well, and maybe personal relations through submitting a policy paper. So moving on to the next question. So first that was sent in the chat by Emily Day. So I'll read that question first. And then next was JS who as their hand up. So I'll go to Emily's question first, which I think is a really, really good question. So can you give examples of how different audiences change the way you structure a policy paper or present recommendations?
Yeah. Yeah, I can. I think there is I think there is a sort of a general rule that if you are giving policy recommendations to mid and senior civil servants, they are, as a general rule of thumb, interested in more like granular recommendations. It has to be very specific. It has to be very in-depth into the subject matter that you're dealing with. It has to be very actionable. And there you have to clearly demonstrate that you understand the constraints and you understand the opportunities that they have available. And this is also your option and your possibility to break down some of these constraints, which is, I think, is a wonderful thing that we are able to do. And that is definitely one of the finest things that we can do when we are talking about giving policy advice. Then there is something different, for example, when you are talking to parliamentarians. Parliamentarians can come to you and ask for your advice on a specific subject matter. And unlike civil servants, who are incredibly clever people, who are experts in their own right and the subject matter that they're working with, parliamentarians, they don't necessarily have the same level of expertise, and they don't have necessarily the same level of insight into a subject matter. And they would normally come to you for that insight, for you to explain to them, so this is the problem, this is what you can do, this is what you can do. But it's a more of a lighter way to do things, because they don't have the same they're not looking for the same type of advice, is basically what it is. So it really depends on, and it really underscores that it's very important that you understand who your audience is and what they would traditionally look to. But by the way, you know, when you would write these recommendations, you would also quickly get a sense of, you know, what is it that they're looking for in terms of, you know, how much detail is it that they're looking for. You can also go overboard and just, you know, give too much, which is also not necessarily very helpful. And I think we also always need to remember that these people, they're busy people, and they don't have time to read 55 pages about a subject matter problem necessarily.
It's great. It's a very, very informative answer there. I think that's something many things well worth noting in that. So thank you very much. And thanks for the question. I think that's a really good one. So next up we have Jayesh, and then I will follow. That will then be followed by Cheyenne's question in the chat. So I'll hand it over to Jayesh to ask the question.
Right. Thanks very much, and thanks for the talk so far. My question was about the geopolitical risk you mentioned earlier, regarding the kind of increased or danger in the security environment and the unpredictability. How do you make your policy recommendations adaptable, and how do you ensure there's kind of resilience that exists in the policy recommendation so they have a longer term utility?
If I understand you correctly, so I spoke about the geopolitical risks as, you know, this is the reality that the policymaker is operating in, and the geopolitical risks is about, you know, can be constraining, but it can also be an opportunity. And I think for you, it really is about you as the expert. For you, it is very much about being able to recognize there are obviously some constraints. You know, in an ideal world, you would do X, Y, Z. But in the real world, you know, you have to recognize these constraints, and then you have an opportunity. And I think that's also what I spoke about earlier, that was one of the greatest things that we could do, is to point out to, you know, we could look at these constraints differently. Are there opportunities within these constraints that we can take that can bring forward whatever problem it is that you're trying to solve? So I think that the real trick really is to be so clear around the constraints and so clear about opportunity. And for you to be able to be that, you have to have your expert knowledge. You really have to know your subject matter. And once you do that, then you are able to give these opportunities and point to these different ways forward. And sometimes it's you know, to be able to illuminate other ways to do things is also a good thing, because then your policymaker can go back into the system and say, hey, maybe we could do different things differently. Maybe we should prioritize differently. And that is also a wonderful thing that you are able to, if you're able to do that. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, Jayesh. And I think that leads really well on to Cheyenne's question, which is in the chat. And the question is, how do we approach formulating policy recommendations for futuristic cases which haven't happened yet? for example, getting policymakers to consider the dangers of AI in the nuclear decision-making process?
Right. I think that's also a really good question. And it speaks to when I said to begin with that there had to be a connection to policy. And there were two ways that there could be a connection to policy. One way is when the problem is already on the policymaker's desk, and the other clear connection to policy is when you think that the problem should be on your policymaker's desk. And in that case, your step one would be to to identify, okay, this is obviously not on the policymaker's desk. I need to put it there. How do I go about that? And then you start from the beginning, like, how is this? Why is this a problem? And why is this a problem in the future? And then you go through all the various steps. But I would like to say, when we are talking about, problems of the future, that currently, and this is something I think most governments are very interested in, is people to use futures and foresight methodologies. That's just a sort of a top tip to do. But then is when it's about something in the future, then your job is to be able to put it on the desk of your policymaker. Really. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, yeah, I think that was a really good question as well. I think it's been a great set of questions so far. So with that question out the way, I will pass it on now to Aisha to ask a question. So yeah, please unmute yourself and feel free to speak to Gry directly.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. So my question is related to my work, which I usually do. I usually write policy briefs. So it came to my mind that what is the difference between a policy brief and a full policy recommendation like you suggested? And when should each format be used in different circumstances, of course?
Right. Well, you cut out a little bit there. So you're asking, what is the difference between a policy brief and a policy recommendation?
Yeah.
Yes.
That,
Okay. No? Okay. Well, I don't think so. It depends. To me, a policy brief can of course be a piece where you are not necessarily giving a recommendation, but in my opinion, a policy brief would always have a recommendation. So a policy brief and a policy recommendation is sort of two sides of the same coin, where a policy brief, in my opinion, should always have a policy recommendation. And the recommendation can be, also just to say, so this is actually a problem, and you guys, you have no idea this is a problem, as we just talked about with the previous question. I would say that you would always have a policy recommendation in your policy brief. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that answer, Gry. I think that that clears that up. So now I'll pass it on to Christelle, if you would like to speak directly and ask a question.
Thank you so much, Declan. Thank you so much, Gry, for this very insightful presentation. So my question really relates to changing circumstances while a project is ongoing. So personally, I am from Lebanon and working in Lebanon currently, and some of the projects I'm on are in advanced stages of the research. So the desk research and fieldwork have already been conducted, and we are running against tight deadlines, but the war and the changing circumstances have really majorly impacted the topics that we are working on, and this will continue, to be impacted moving forward into the future. So really, I understand, I guess, how to pivot when the research is in its early stages or midway through. But at this point, some of the research that we've done does seem to be not as significant as it could have been, even if it's still relevant. So I guess what I'd like your advice on, or what I'm trying to grapple with, is the idea of publishing something that may already be obsolete by the time it's out, or with a few modifications and additions, knowing that it would be much better if we had the ability to redo or supplement the research with more fieldwork which we unfortunately don't have that option at this point. So what are your thoughts, or what would you do, I guess, if you were faced with a similar situation? Thank you.
So I have been faced with a similar situation, and there the project became we changed the project. We kind of just changed the methodology, which allowed us to continue the project. But it also meant that fundamentally the project would, have a different outcome. But I was, please don't get me wrong, I was lucky enough that this happened relatively early in the project. And I think you are in a completely different situation because this is happening towards the end of your project. But I did notice that you said that this is still relevant research, and I would take that, and I would rest assured that if your research is relevant, it's relevant, and you can always. I think the best tip is that when you are submitting this research to whomever you are submitting it to, I would clearly identify that, how things they have changed and how some of this research and why the research is still relevant. And then I will point towards what is next then for my research. I have all this knowledge, I have all of these insights, and now this has happened. So I am like perfect to bring this forward to the next stage. That is how I would do it. And I would be like pivoting and clearly putting the perspective on, well, based on this very relevant research, your perspective is this.
That's very relevant. Thank you so much. Very helpful.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for another great question and another very insightful answer in what is a space that is very turbulent, to say the least sometimes. So yeah, I think that we now have another question that is in the chat from Tayaba, which is I think an interesting one as well for from particularly people I think used to kind of an academic way of working and writing theses and academic papers. Can we use a theoretical framework while explaining the research problem in the policy paper before suggesting the concrete policy recommendation? And also, what is the methodology required while writing a policy paper?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part, Declan.
So the last part was, and what methodology is required while writing a policy paper?
Right. I would like to say one thing first, that you as scholars and as future scholars, you should also do policy work. It doesn't mean that you can't use your various methodologies at all. Of course, you are not putting, a long methodological section into a policy paper of any kind, but it doesn't mean that you cannot use it. So if you have a theoretical framework that guides you towards identifying a problem and that guides you towards giving a recommendation, you should just use that. And I think it's very important that this it's a bit of an artificial sort of wall between academia and policy. It is very well connected, really. And I'm not giving any policy-wise advice that is not based on my methodologies as an academic. So I think it's very important that you understand that it's not there's no like sharp border between those two, and you can use your methodologies. That's what you have. That is your super strength. That's your superpower, that you have these methodologies that can help you understand and dissect different political problems, and that can help you in identifying possible ways forward for governments or international organizations to solve a problem. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, again, another really interesting question and a great bit of advice, whether, you're, and yes, it's something that's a very interesting kind of space to navigate when you feel like you're navigating between academia and policy, that these so-called lines perhaps are not what they appear to be at times, or that may not even be existent. So I think that's really important advice to hear early on, whether you're pursuing, a doctorate or not, for example, in the field. So at the moment we have no further audience questions. So I'd encourage you to take up this opportunity if there's anything that comes to mind. And in the meantime, I want to ask another question myself about, obviously now you have quite a few years of experience in the field, and you've been producing policy recommendations for a long time. Do you feel that have you noticed any kind of changes in either the landscape in terms of how to go about submitting policy recommendations, the current kind of routes and opportunities to do such a thing? Are they similar? Have they changed? And also I mean, it might be a bit of a big question to add on to the end of it, but how has geopolitics has geopolitics also kind of influenced how the practice of policy recommendation, making policy recommendations, or are things generally more are things generally more consistent in terms of how to submit one and how to make these recommendations? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't, over these years that I have been in the policy world, I don't know if it is the years or the fact that I have been moving around in different countries. I think because it's my sense that there is more appetite to have policy recommendations from experts. I feel that there is more recognition that you can have epistemic communities, and an epistemic community is important to have, and I feel that has become more and more recognized amongst policymakers. But it also could still be because I have been moving countries. I can only stay here in the UK, and in certain other European countries, it's clear to see that our advice is well sought after. And then you also said something, about geopolitical circumstances, if they have influenced the way that we do policy recommendations. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, I think that they have always influenced the way that you're doing policy recommendations, because the geopolitical circumstances, they have always been the constraint / the opportunity to do something about a problem that you feel needs to be solved. I would say that, of course, currently we have, in my line of work, my expertise, what I'm working with, NATO Russia in particular. Of course, this is a highly difficult issue to deal with, and this is a difficult issue for everybody. It's a difficult issue for governments, for the epistemic community, and of course, everybody who is experiencing the war. And so in that sense, I would say that this has made things difficult. Well, at least for my expertise, this has been difficult to deal with.
Yeah, thank you very much for the answers on that. And we now have a few questions in the chat. So I will. So Aisha has asked, when framing a policy problem, how do you ensure that you're presenting a balanced view that includes multiple perspectives, especially when there are competing interests involved?
Sorry, could you say that again? I think my connection is a little. When you're framing a policy problem.
Yeah. So when you're framing a policy problem, how do you ensure that you're presenting a balanced view that includes multiple perspectives, especially when there are competing interests involved?
Well, you ensure that you're presenting a balanced view because you are using your methodologies and you are using all your expertise and all your knowledge. You have identified in your analysis, you have identified the constraints, you have identified the opportunities, but for you to present something that is balanced lies with you and your analysis and the quality of your analysis and your understanding of who it is that you're writing to. It's a little bit the same thing we had earlier around theoretical frameworks, etc. You should have a solid and well-founded analysis, and that would automatically, in lack of a better word, would automatically lead to a balanced approach to whatever problem it is you're dealing with.
Right, thank you very much, and thanks for another really good question, Aisha. So next we have another question from Emily Day, which is how can policy recommendations be effectively communicated to leaders who are skeptical of conventional wisdom or dismissive of established international norms and rules?
Yeah, well, so if I knew that, if we knew that, I'm sure that I would write an awful lot of different policy recommendations. I think that it's a difficult question to really answer. Again, I must say it rests on the quality of your analysis. First of all, it rests on your ability to understand who is at the receiving end. You have to understand, as I said at one point, policymaking is complex. It's a complex thing. There are competing, competing constraints. They're competing priorities, they have limited information, they have limited resources, and whatever politics that is also going on. It's very complex to make policy. And the more you understand of this and understand of the situation that the person that you would really like to influence, the more you can illustrate that you understand that, and the more you can point to a way out of it. I guess that's the best I can say. But of course, if people, they don't want to listen, they don't want to listen. And there's only so much you can do about it in the end. But what it is about, having a solid and thorough analysis, and it is about understanding your audience, basically.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gry. Yeah, I think that's another really, really interesting question that is something that I think has a lot of people in the field scratching their heads at the moment. I wonder how to progress with it. But so I'll now move on to the next question. So I think these next two, I think, will be the last two questions as we're getting close to the hour mark. So Maida has asked, so said, my question is related to the previous question about foresight policy recommendations. You said that if the issue is not already on the policymaker's table, then work needs to be done for it to be on the table. In terms of security, some policymakers and practitioners believe that if it is not on the table, for example, it is very unlikely to happen despite the possible disruptive impact that the issue could have if it does occur, or simply because they believe that it is never going to happen. There is no point wasting resources on the issue you present as a problem. How do you overcome these hindrances or bias?
Right. Again, it is, I think, to be able to get as much knowledge and insight into how policies are being made in the administration or the ministry or the office that you're trying to impact, where you want to place a problem on their desk. The more you know about, what the competing priorities are in that particular government, the more you know about, what kind of resources they actually have available. If you, not all governments have, well, no governments have endless amounts of financial resources, for example. So it's also important that you understand financial resources, what is actually available, other resources, it could also be expert resources, staff resources, etc., etc. But the more you know about, the internal competition or the internal machinations, the easier it is for you to understand how you can put your problem on their desk. It is your opportunity to break down the constraints and say, this is not the right way that you're looking at things. Instead, you need to, you should be able to break down the, what did I call it earlier? The constraints and the way that they have been thinking about things. Sometimes government, they can be very locked in the same and look at things in the same way as they have always been looking at things. Sadly, I think there are a lot of analogical reasoning in governments today. And if you're able to break these things down with your solid analysis and based on your knowledge about how the machinations actually are in that particular department or office or ministry or whatever it is, then you stand a better chance to actually put it on the desk of the policymaker.
Thank you very much. I think that's some more great advice on that, on what is again a very challenging issue. So we currently have one more question in the chat from Jayesh, which is, what are some effective strategies for framing policy recommendations that can resonate across diverse political agendas within international organizations such as NATO?
Right. So I think that when you have such as NATO, when you have an organization like that, remember I spoke about there are different tools to sort of reach the same outcome. And I think when you're talking about NATO, I think a good way to start is to look at these strategy documents that you would have. You would have the strategic concepts, you would have various NATO summit decisions, etc., as a good way to understand and a good way to frame. So this is the negotiated consensus that you have. However, at the same time, you also need to, and I'm really sorry, I feel I'm repeating myself, but you also need to understand that there are different actors within NATO, so that you have a negotiated standpoint, you have a negotiated policy, but underneath that, there are loads of, diversions, there are loads of non-agreement, for example, that you also need to be aware of. So again, it's about you understanding and knowing your audience. It really, really is. And to be able to recognize that there are limits. Like I said here, therefore, to be convincing, recommendation must at least acknowledge the limited range of options available to policymakers. That's basically what I'm saying there. You need to recognize the situation that they're in, all of them that they're in, and then you can go forward from there.
Thank you very much for that question, Jayesh. And I think as we have no more questions, I think that is a good point and a good answer from Gry as well to wrap things up as well. So yeah, I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much, Gry, for speaking to the Emerging Voices Network. I think everybody will really appreciate this feedback from somebody with such experience on these matters, and the range of advice as well, and how it's been broken down. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank the EVN members for great questions today, really great attendance. I think it led to a really, really interesting discussion that's given us a lot to think about on our work going forwards. And I'd like to remind everybody as well that the session was recorded. So if maybe you joined late, or if you've had internet disruption throughout, you'll be able to watch the entire recording up on the website very soon. So thank you very much, Gry, and for everybody for coming.
Thank
And
you for
I hope
inviting me, and thank you for all your wonderful questions. Sorry.
Great. No problem. No, it's been great having you on. So thank you very much, everybody. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your week, regardless of what's been going on in the international news. And yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.